The sea is a mirror of grey slate, rising and falling in a heavy, agonizing swell. It is just past 6 in the morning on October 21st, 1805. Off Cape Trafalgar, on the southwest coast of Spain, two of the greatest fleets ever assembled are closing on one another. The wind is tragically light, barely enough to give the massive ships steerage, reducing their speed to a mere 2 or 3 knots. For the men of the British Royal Navy, this slow, crawling approach is an exercise in pure tension. They are outnumbered and outgunned. Their 27 ships of the line are sailing toward a combined French and Spanish fleet of 33. The British count 2,148 guns. The enemy boasts 2,568. But the British fleet has an advantage that cannot be quantified by statistics: the mind of its commander, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. For a century, naval warfare had been a rigid, formalized affair. The doctrine of the formal line of battle dictated that two fleets sail in parallel lines, exchanging broadsides until one side gave way. It was a stately, predictable, and often indecisive form of combat. Nelson, however, despised this. He called such battles mere skirmishes. He was not here to win a polite engagement. He was here to annihilate the enemy. Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions to invade England rested on this combined fleet. If it could seize control of the English Channel, even for a day, the invasion barges would cross. Nelson's task was to ensure this never happened, and to do so with such finality that the threat would be removed for good. His plan, which he had obsessively detailed to his captains weeks before, was codenamed the Nelson Touch. It was audacious, brilliant, and bordered on suicidal. He had no intention of forming a parallel line. Instead, he had divided his smaller fleet into 2 columns, which would sail perpendicularly into the enemy's sprawling, crescent-shaped line. The goal was to smash through their formation in 2 places, shattering their center and rear, and isolating the van or front of the fleet. This would prevent the combined fleet from using its superior numbers, turning the battle from a long-range gunnery duel into a pell-mell battle. A chaotic, close-quarters melee, where, Nelson knew, the superior seamanship and faster gunnery of his crews would be decisive. But the risk was immense. The lead ships of his columns would have to endure the concentrated, raking fire of multiple enemy ships for nearly 40 minutes before they could bring their own broadsides to bear. They would be sailing directly into the teeth of the dragon, utterly exposed, hoping to survive long enough to land a killing blow. Aboard his 104-gun flagship, HMS Victory, Nelson walks the quarterdeck, a slight, one-armed, one-eyed figure who commands a messianic devotion from his men. He is the physical embodiment of the Royal Navy's aggressive spirit. At his side is Captain Thomas Hardy, the stoic and professional flag captain of the Victory. Nelson's plan is now in motion. At 8 in the morning the order is given, and the British fleet begins to maneuver, slowly forming into 2 distinct columns. The first, the weather column, is led by Nelson himself, aimed at the enemy's center. The second, the leeward column, is led by his trusted second-in-command, Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, aboard the 112-gun HMS Royal Sovereign. Collingwood, a brilliant and courageous officer in his own right, understands Nelson's intentions perfectly. As his column begins its agonizingly slow approach, he turns to his officers. He remarks that now, gentlemen, they should do something today which the world may talk of hereafter. The mood in the combined fleet is one of grim apprehension. Their commander, the French Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, is a competent seaman, but a man broken by Nelson's reputation. He is aboard his 80-gun flagship, Bucentaure, and he is terrified. For months, Nelson had blockaded him in Cadiz, and Villeneuve had only sailed now under the direct, insulting order from Napoleon, who was sending a replacement to relieve him of command. He is sailing into battle not with a plan for victory, but with a desperate hope to avoid total disaster. His Spanish counterpart, Admiral Federico Gravina, is a brave and respected commander, but his fleet is undermanned and his crews poorly trained. The Spanish ships, like the massive 112-gun Príncipe de Asturias or the colossal 140-gun Santísima Trinidad, are some of the largest and most powerful in the world, but they are slow, and their gunners are no match for the British. As the morning wears on, the two British columns resemble two spears, pointed directly at the long, wavering line of the combined fleet. The light winds are a torment. The crews, already prepared for battle, stand at their guns, the decks sanded to absorb the inevitable blood. The tension is palpable. The only sounds are the creaking of the massive wooden hulls, the snap of the sails as they struggle to catch the meagre breeze, and the heavy, rhythmic groan of the sea. Then, at 11:45 a.m., a string of colourful flags suddenly ascends the mast of HMS Victory. It is a signal from Nelson to the entire fleet. The message is spelled out, flag by flag. England expects that every man will do his duty. A ripple of understanding passes from ship to ship. It is not a tactical order, but a profound appeal to their patriotism, their professionalism, and their personal loyalty to him. On the decks of the ships, a low murmur grows into a massive, roaring cheer that rolls across the water, a defiant sound of 30 ships and thousands of men dedicating themselves to the coming slaughter. The time for waiting is over. The Nelson touch is about to be put to the test. It is Vice Admiral Collingwood who draws first blood. His ship, HMS Royal Sovereign, is a new vessel, her copper bottom clean, and she is a faster sailor than the rest of the fleet. For nearly an hour, she has been pulling ahead of the leeward column, a lone champion surging forward into the enemy's rear. Collingwood, watching his ship outpace its support, is unflinching. He intends to be the first in the fight. On the combined fleet's line, the gun crews of the Spanish 112-gun Santa Ana and the French 74-gun Fougueux watch this single British ship approach. They have range and they open fire. The first cannonballs of the Battle of Trafalgar begin their deadly journey, smashing into the water around Royal Sovereign's bow. But the heavy ocean's swell makes aiming a difficult art, especially for the less experienced gunners of the combined fleet. Still, shots begin to find their mark. Wood splinters, rigging is cut, but the ship does not slow. It sails on, enduring the fire, a silent, implacable challenger. At approximately 10 minutes past noon, Royal Sovereign reaches the enemy line. Collingwood orders his helm turned, and the massive ship slides between the Santa Ana and the Fougueux. It is a moment of pure tactical brilliance. For this one instant, Royal Sovereign has crossed the T of its opponents. The order is given. The British gun crews, drilled relentlessly, fire their first broadside. It is a cataclysm. The Royal Sovereign unleashes its portside cannons, a volley of over 50 guns, directly into the stern of the Santa Ana. The concentrated fire, a mix of round shot and grape shot, rakes the Spanish flagship from stern to bow. The shot travels the entire length of the ship's decks, smashing cannons from their carriages, obliterating entire gun crews, and transforming the crowded decks into a charnel house. At the very same moment, Royal Sovereign fires its starboard broadside into the Fougueux, blasting its hull and rigging. In less than 2 minutes, Collingwood's single ship has mortally wounded one enemy flagship and crippled another. But now it is in a sea of enemies. Having broken the line, Royal Sovereign is surrounded. The Fougueux, the Indomitable, the San Leandro, and the Santa Ana all converge, pouring fire into the British ship from all directions. For 15 long minutes, Royal Sovereign fights alone, a single British ship in a swarm of 4 enemy vessels, her masts crashing down, her hull shattered. But her guns, firing at a rate the Spanish and French cannot comprehend, never falling silent. Collingwood, his coat torn by shrapnel, calmly paces the deck, munching an apple as his ship is torn to pieces around him, waiting for the rest of his column to arrive. While Collingwood and his leeward column are engulfed in a desperate melee in the enemy's rear, Nelson's weather column is still, agonizingly, crawling toward the center of the combined fleet's line. HMS Victory Flying the Admiral's flag is the target. Every enemy cannon that can be brought to bear is aimed at her. For nearly 40 minutes, Nelson, Hardy, and the men on Victory's upper decks endure a hellish one-sided bombardment. The light winds, which so frustrated the Admiral, now prove to be a deadly liability. The ship moves at a walking pace, a giant, slow-moving target for French and Spanish gunnery. Chain shot rips through the rigging, tearing the complex web of ropes and sails to shreds. Round shot plows into the thick oak hull, sending lethal showers of splinters, the true killer on these wooden decks, scything across the gun crews. Men fall and are quietly carried below. The ship's wheel is smashed. A cannonball strikes a spar, killing Nelson's secretary, John Scott. Another shot cuts down a file of 8 Marines on the poop deck. Nelson, a conspicuous figure in his vice admiral's coat, paces the deck as if on parade, refusing to take cover, a visible sign of calm and defiance to his men. His officers, terrified he will be killed before the first shot is even fired, watch him with dread. But Victory does not fire back. Her guns are loaded, her crews are ready, but they are pointing at the enemy's broadside. To fire now would be a waste. They are waiting for the perfect shot, the one Nelson has gambled everything to achieve. At last, at 12:45 p.m., the moment comes. Victory arrives at the enemy line. Her target is the 80-gun French flagship, Bucentaure, commanded by the hapless Villeneuve. Captain Hardy steers Victory masterfully, slicing through the gap directly astern of the French flagship. The Victory is so close that her yardarms scrape the rigging of the Bucentaure. Now, the British ship is in the perfect position. It has crossed the T. Villeneuve's flagship, with its guns pointing uselessly out to the side, can only watch as Victory's entire portside battery of 50 guns, double-shotted with round shot and grape shot, is unleashed at point-blank range. It is a single, apocalyptic blast. The broadside travels the entire 200-foot length of the Bucentaure's crowded gun decks. It dismounts 20 cannons, kills or wounds an estimated 400 men in an instant, and effectively destroys the French flagship's ability to fight. But Victory's trial is not over. As she recoils from this devastating broadside, she collides with the 74-gun French ship, Redoutable. Captain Jean-Jacques Lucas, the Redoutable's commander, is a fierce and capable officer. He has specifically trained his men not for a gunnery duel, which he knows the British will win, but for close quarters boarding. As the two great ships grind together, their hulls locking, the Redoutable's crew unleashes a storm of musket fire and grenades from her fighting tops, the platforms high on the masts. The Victory is now trapped, her guns unable to depress far enough to hit the ship latched to her side. The battle for the flagship has become an intimate, brutal deck-to-deck fight. The battle for the British flagship becomes a microcosm of the pell-mell fight Nelson had desired, but with a terrible, personal cost. The Redoutable, commanded by the astute Captain Jean-Jacques Lucas, is a ship trained for this exact moment. Lucas knows he cannot outshoot the Victory in a conventional duel. His strategy is to close, lock ships, and overwhelm the British with a disciplined storm of close-range fire and a boarding action. His fighting tops, the platforms high on the masts, are crowded with trained marksmen and sailors armed with grenades. While the Victory's lower gun decks continue to fire into other enemy ships, her upper deck, exposed to the Redoutable, becomes a killing field. A furious, intimate battle rages. French sailors hurl grenades onto Victory's deck, while sharpshooters in the rigging fire with methodical accuracy. The targets are the officers, the gun captains, the Marines, anyone who represents command or control. The two colossal ships are ground together so tightly that the muzzles of Redoutable's cannons cannot be run out. They fire from inside their own ship, the flames scorching Victory's hull. British Marines on Victory's poop deck return fire, but they are terribly exposed. Nelson, still pacing the quarterdeck with Captain Hardy, is a shockingly visible target in his decorated admiral's coat. His officers had begged him to cover his decorations, but he had refused. At approximately 1:15 p.m., As the fight is at its most ferocious, a musket ball is fired from the mizzen-top of the Redoubtable, less than 50 feet away. The shot finds its mark. Nelson is struck. The ball enters his left shoulder, passes through his lung, and lodges in his spine. He collapses to the deck, on the very spot where his secretary had been killed an hour before. Captain Hardy rushes to his side. Nelson is conscious and aware of the wound's severity, informing Hardy that he has finally been done for. As Marines gently lift their dying admiral, he covers his face and decorations with a handkerchief so as not to be recognized and dishearten his men. He is carried below, down to the dark, cramped confines of the orlop deck, the ship's cockpit, where the surgeon is already overwhelmed with the wounded and the dying. Above him, the battle rages on. The Redoutable's crew, sensing a moment of weakness, attempts to board Victory. But the British flagship is not alone for long. The Fighting Temeraire, a 98-gun British ship, has followed Victory into the line. It looms out of the smoke, gliding up on the other side of the Redoubtable, and fires a catastrophic broadside that shatters the French ship's hull. The Redoubtable is now trapped, sandwiched between two British first-rates, and is systematically torn to pieces. Captain Lucas, despite being severely wounded, continues to fight until his ship is a dismasted, sinking wreck. But the fatal shot has been fired. The architect of the Nelson touch is now below decks, his life ebbing away as his greatest masterpiece unfolds on the sea above. With Nelson dying below and his flagship locked in a death struggle, the Battle of Trafalgar has now dissolved into the very pell-mell action he had engineered. The ordered lines are gone, replaced by a chaotic, swirling melee of individual ships and small groups, shrouded in an impenetrable fog of war. The air is filled with the continuous, deafening roar of cannons, a sound so profound it drowns out all human commands. Choking, acrid clouds of black gunpowder smoke blanket the sea, reducing visibility to a few yards. Ships loom out of the smoke like phantoms, unleash a broadside, and are swallowed again. Captains navigate not by sight of their fleet, but by the flash of gunfire and the terrifying immediate appearance of an enemy hull. This is the fight the British were born for. In this close-quarters brawl, superior training and technology become the decisive factors. The core of this advantage is British gunnery. The Royal Navy drills its crews relentlessly. A British gun crew can load, aim, and fire a full broadside every 90 seconds. Their French and Spanish counterparts, often composed of less experienced sailors or even soldiers, are lucky to fire once every 3 minutes. This 2-to-1, sometimes 3-to-1, advantage in firepower is overwhelming. In the time it takes the Bucentaur or the Santa Ana to fire a single volley, a British ship like the Temeraire or the Neptune has already fired 2, smashing their hulls and sweeping their decks. The British also employ a secret weapon at this range, the carronade. Nicknamed the Smasher, it is a short-barreled, large-caliber cannon. Useless at a distance, it is a monster at close quarters. It fires a massive 68-pound ball at low velocity, designed not to punch a neat hole, but to smash the enemy's oak hull to pieces. The effect is catastrophic. But the true killer in this wooden world is not the cannonball itself, but the splinters. When a 32-pound round shot strikes the inner wall of a ship, it blasts huge shards and splinters of the ship's own oak hull across the gun deck. These wooden projectiles fly like shrapnel, scything down the gun crews, causing horrific, grievous wounds. The British tactic of firing into the enemy's hull rather than at their rigging maximizes this gruesome effect, while the French aim high, trying to disable the British ships by cutting their masts and sails. The British aim low, firing into the packed gun decks, killing the men who work the cannons. As the battle rages, the isolated centre and rear of the combined fleet are systematically, brutally, and efficiently torn apart. While Victory is locked in her own desperate duel, the rest of Nelson's column follows her into the breach, transforming the heart of the combined fleet's line into a kill zone. The French flagship, Bucentaur, already shattered by victory's initial raking broadside, is now helpless. Disabled and unable to maneuver, she is pounded mercilessly by the British ships Neptune, Leviathan, and Conqueror as they pass by. On her decks, Vice Admiral Villeneuve watches his fleet disintegrate. He knows he is beaten. With his masts gone and his gun decks silenced, he is forced to surrender. The terrified French commander, who had dreaded facing Nelson, is now a prisoner, his flagship a floating wreck. Further down the line, the Spanish contingent is meeting a similar fate. In the rear, Admiral Federico Gravina, aboard the 112-gun Príncipe de Asturias, fights with a courage his French counterpart lacked. He and his squadron are swarmed by the fresh ships of Collingwood's column, who have now overwhelmed the Santa Ana. The fighting is desperate, but the Spanish gunnery, hampered by the heavy swell and inferior training, cannot match the relentless, rapid fire of the British. Gravina himself is struck, his arm shattered by grapeshot, a mortal wound. He stays on deck, bleeding, refusing to surrender, but his squadron is broken. Perhaps the greatest symbol of the combined fleet's demise is the fate of the Santísima Trinidad. The largest and most powerful warship in the world, her 140 guns and 4 decks tower over the British ships. But in this close-range melee, her size is a liability, making her a massive target. She is surrounded by a pack of British 74-gun ships, the workhorses of the Royal Navy. The Neptune, Leviathan, and Africa all converge on her, pouring broadside after broadside into her hull. The smasher carronades do their brutal work, blasting her gun ports and sweeping her decks. The Spanish giant, with more guns than any other ship on the sea, is methodically dismasted, her hull breached, her guns silenced, until she is nothing but a floating, battered fortress, forced to strike her colours. By 2 p.m, Nelson's plan has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The centre and rear of the combined fleet have ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. They are now just a collection of individual disabled ships, waiting to be captured. And what of the van? The 10 or so French and Spanish ships at the front of the line, which Nelson's attack had successfully cut off, have continued to sail on, carried by the light breeze. They are now miles away from the battle, unable to turn back in the light winds to aid their doomed commanders. The battle has been decided. It is no longer a fight for victory, but a simple, grim harvest of the defeated. By 4 p.m, the battle, as a contest, is over. The roar of the great broadsides has faded into sporadic, individual cannon shots as the last pockets of resistance are extinguished. The sea is a vast floating graveyard of shattered masts, torn rigging, and the dismasted hulks of 21 French and Spanish ships of the line. These once proud vessels are now floating charnel houses, their decks slick with blood, their hulls riddled with holes. The surviving ships of the combined fleet, including the van that had sailed on, are now in full flight, desperately seeking the safety of Cadiz. The British victory is not just complete, it is total. Not a single British ship has been lost. But deep below the victorious quarterdeck of HMS Victory, in the dim, lantern-lit hell of the orlop deck, the architect of this triumph is dying. The air is thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and bilge water. The ship's surgeon, William Beatty, has already examined the wound and knows it is mortal. Nelson is laid on a pallet, paralysed from the waist down, his breathing shallow. He is in agonizing pain, but his mind is sharp, his thoughts consumed not by his own fate, but by the battle raging above. He listens to the cheers of the gun crews as enemy ships strike their colours, and he repeatedly asks for his flag captain. Finally, Captain Thomas Hardy is able to leave the deck. He descends into the gloom and kneels by his dying admiral. Nelson, his voice weak, asks for the news. Hardy confirms what Nelson already knows in his heart. The victory is complete and glorious. He reports that 15 enemy ships have been taken. Nelson, even in death, is the ultimate predator. "That is well," he murmurs, "but I had bargained for 20. He urges Hardy to make sure the fleet anchors, as he has prophetically foreseen the massive storm that is now gathering on the horizon. Hardy returns to the deck for a final time before coming back down to say his last goodbye. The two men, the stoic captain and his brilliant, passionate admiral, grasp hands. Nelson, knowing the end is near, asks Hardy to kiss him. Hardy does so, on the cheek. Nelson, now fading, utters his final immortal words, a perfect summary of his life and his fanatical sense of purpose. Thank God, I have done my duty. At 4:30 p.m., just as the last shots of his greatest victory echo across the water, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, the saviour of Britain and the master of the Nelson touch, is dead. His cost to the combined fleet was catastrophic, nearly 4,400 killed, 2,500 wounded, and over 7,000 captured. The British, by contrast, had suffered only 450 killed and 1,250 wounded. Nelson had achieved his annihilation, but the price of this perfect victory was his own life. The cheers for the complete and glorious victory were short-lived, replaced by a new, more ancient enemy, the sea itself. Nelson's final, lucid order to Captain Hardy, to anchor the fleet, had been prophetic. As the sun set on October 21st, 1805, a massive storm, which had been brewing on the horizon, descended upon the shattered fleets. The light winds that had so frustrated the approach were replaced by a howling gale, and the heavy ocean swell transformed into mountainous collapsing waves. For the British Royal Navy, the fight for victory was over. The fight for survival had just begun. The British fleet was triumphant, but it was also a wreck. Victory was dismasted. Royal Sovereign was a crippled hulk, and many other ships were barely seaworthy, their rigging shot to pieces. But their condition was infinitely better than that of their prizes. The 21 captured French and Spanish ships were floating coffins, riddled with holes, their pumps failing, and their decks still slick with the dead and dying. Aboard each of these captured vessels was a small British prize crew, often no more than 50 men, tasked with guarding hundreds of bitter, defeated enemy prisoners, all while trying to keep the shattered ships from sinking in the hurricane-force winds. What followed was 4 days of pure, unrelenting horror. The storm, which raged until October 25th, was more terrifying than the battle itself. Men who had bravely faced cannon fire now lashed themselves to the decks to avoid being washed overboard. The primary sound was no longer the roar of guns, but the scream of the wind through shot-torn rigging and the sickening groan of damaged hulls straining against the waves. The British prize crews, exhausted from the battle, fought shoulder to shoulder with their French and Spanish prisoners, manning the pumps in a desperate shared struggle to stay alive. But it was a losing effort. One by one, the great prizes of Trafalgar were reclaimed by the Atlantic. The Redoubtable, the fierce ship that had claimed Nelson's life, sank in the storm, taking many of her crew, both French and British, with her. The mighty Santissima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world, was scuttled by her captors, who set her aflame before she foundered. Villeneuve's own flagship, the Bucentaure, was wrecked upon the shore, the Fougueux, the Indomptable. They all met their end, either sinking in the deep, crashing onto the rocks of Cape Trafalgar, or being scuttled by their captors who could not hold them. Of the 21 ships captured by the British at the end of the battle, the great storm ensured that only 4 would ultimately make it back to Gibraltar as trophies. The annihilation was now complete, finished not by British guns, but by the awesome, pitiless power of nature. When the battered remnants of the British fleet, shepherding their 4 hard-won prizes, limped back to England, they brought with them news that sent the nation into a paroxysm of contradictory emotion, ecstatic joy, and profound public grief. The threat of French invasion, which had hung over the island like a death shroud for years, was gone. The combined fleet was not just defeated, it was annihilated. But the cost, the death of Lord Nelson, their national saviour, was almost too much to bear. His body, preserved in a cask of brandy, was returned to a hero's funeral, a spectacle of mourning and gratitude on a scale never before seen. But the strategic consequences of the battle were far greater than even Nelson could have known. The victory was absolute. In a single afternoon, the Royal Navy had effectively erased French and Spanish sea power. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had been waiting with his Armée d'Angleterre at Boulogne, had already turned his gaze eastward, frustrated by his admiral's inability to gain him even temporary control of the English Channel. Trafalgar made this turn permanent. His ambitions at sea were over. He could march his armies across Europe, from Austerlitz to Moscow, but he was forever a prisoner of the continent. The invasion of Britain was now a physical impossibility. With no one left to challenge them, the British Royal Navy became the undisputed masters of the world's oceans. This was the beginning of the Pax Britannica, a century of global British domination secured not by its armies, but by its unstoppable fleet. For the next 100 years, from 1805 until the rise of Imperial Germany before World War I, no other nation could field a navy that could seriously threaten British supremacy. This naval dominance allowed Britain to build a global empire on which the sun, famously, never set. The Royal Navy protected its trade routes, blockaded its enemies, and projected British power to the furthest corners of the globe. The Nelson touch had done more than just win a battle. It had fundamentally altered the course of the 19th century. Napoleon's continental system, his attempt to blockade Britain economically from Europe, was rendered futile by a power that could now blockade all of Europe from the sea. While the Napoleonic Wars would rage on land for another decade, culminating at Waterloo, the war at sea was over. It had been won in a single, brutal, smoke-choked afternoon off the Spanish coast. The 27 ships of the line that sailed into the enemy's formation at Trafalgar had not just saved England. They had forged a new world order, one that would be policed by the wooden walls of the ships that had perfected the art of pell-mell combat. The Battle of Trafalgar was the glorious, bloody apex of the Age of Sail. It was a victory won by a brilliant revolutionary tactic, but that tactic was only made possible by the men and the machines that executed it. The Nelson touch was, at its core, a profound act of faith. Faith that the British lead ships would survive the 40-minute gauntlet of raking fire, and faith that once the melee began, the British seamen would prove superior. This faith was well placed. The victory was a testament to a system of relentless, brutal, and effective training. The men of the Royal Navy were not amateurs. They were hardened professionals. They lived in the cramped, damp, and dangerous world of the wooden ship. They were drilled in gunnery until the 90-second reload was muscle memory, an automatic response performed in the chaos of battle, surrounded by smoke, death, and the screams of the wounded. This professionalism stood in stark contrast to the crews of the combined fleet. While their officers were often brave, their crews were a mix of nationalities, many inexperienced, some little more than soldiers who had no business on a rolling gun deck. They were further hampered by the heavy ocean swell, which made their already slower gunnery wildly inaccurate. The British, accustomed to the open Atlantic, were better seamen and better gunners. They used their cannons as weapons of annihilation. The carronade, the smasher that was useless at the long, formal ranges of a traditional line battle, became a decisive weapon in the close-quarters brawl Nelson had engineered, blasting hulls and sweeping decks with grape shot. The ships themselves were the pinnacle of 1,000 years of wooden technology. The 74-gun third-rate ship of the line was the workhorse, a perfect balance of firepower and maneuverability. The massive first-rates, like Nelson's 104-gun Victory or Gravina's 112-gun Príncipe de Asturias, were the floating fortresses of their day. But Victory was already 40 years old at the time of the battle, a product of a previous generation of warfare. Trafalgar was, in many ways, the last great battle of its kind. Within a few decades, steam power and ironclad hulls would render these magnificent wooden castles, and the tactics that defined them, completely obsolete. The Nelson touch could never be repeated in an age of long-range, armor-piercing shells. The fates of the battle's key figures were as stark as its outcome. Villeneuve, the French commander, was taken to England as a prisoner. He was paroled and returned to France, only to be found dead in a hotel room. having committed suicide rather than face Napoleon's wrath. The brave Spanish Admiral Gravina died weeks later from the mortal wounds he received aboard the Príncipe de Asturias. Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, the man who had led the leeward column and finished the battle, took command of the fleet. He would never set foot in England again, dying at sea 5 years later, still on blockade duty. And Captain Thomas Hardy, who had kissed his dying admiral, returned to England a hero. He would later become an admiral himself, a living link to Nelson's final glorious moment. These men were the last of a breed, the final practitioners of a form of naval warfare that at Trafalgar reached its perfect and final expression. Trafalgar was the most decisive naval victory in history. It was not merely a tactical masterpiece, it was the definitive full stop on an entire era of warfare. The Nelson touch was a plan born of total, uncompromising confidence in a superior system of men, training, and gunnery. It was a gamble that risked the lead ships of the British fleet in a way that defied all contemporary naval doctrine. But it was a calculated risk. Nelson knew that if his ships could survive the approach, the battle would be won. He knew that the 90-second reload of his gun crews was a more potent weapon than the 140 guns of the Santissima Trinidad. He knew that in the pell-mell chaos of a close-quarters fight, the drilled professional seamen of the Royal Navy would overwhelm the less experienced mixed crews of his enemy. The battle itself was a brutal validation of this belief. It was a fight defined by the sounds of splintering oak, the continuous roar of smasher carronades, and the acrid, choking fog of gunpowder. It was a battle decided by raking fire that cleared entire decks in a single, catastrophic blast, and by the relentless, disciplined speed of the British gun crews. The victory was so total that it created a legend that endures to this day. HMS Victory is preserved, a permanent monument to the man and the moment. Nelson's column stands in the heart of London, a capital city that was never and would never be threatened by Napoleon's armies, thanks to the sacrifice made on that October afternoon. For 100 years, the Pax Britannica was underwritten by the ghosts of Trafalgar. The Royal Navy dominated the seas not just with new steam-powered ironclad battleships, but with the unshakable psychological dominance forged in that battle. The French and Spanish navies were broken, their ambitions shattered, their officer corps decimated. The 21 ships lost by the combined fleet represented an industrial and human catastrophe from which they would never recover in the age of sail. The line of battle, the formal, stately duel that Nelson had so despised, was dead. He had replaced it with a single, brutal, decisive engagement, and in doing so, had secured his nation's future for a century. Trafalgar was, and remains, the perfect victory, a battle that did not just defeat an enemy, but annihilated him, ensuring that for the next 100 years, the unbroken line of the British Royal Navy was the only line that mattered. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next video.